The following program is made possible by the generous sponsorship of Crescent Bank. From the campus of Coastal Carolina University, the Center for Military and Veteran Studies is pleased to present Military Memoirs. Hello and welcome to Military Memoirs, sponsored by the Center for Military and Veteran Studies at Coastal Carolina University. I'm Rod Gregg, and we are pleased to have as our guest on our program Thomas C. Robison, U.S. Army, Vietnam, a Ranger, and in fact a member of the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame, Fort Benning, Georgia. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You grew up in Michigan.
Yes.
One of four kids, son of a grocer who ran a large grocery store in Jackson, Michigan. What was it like growing up in Middle America in the 50s and 60s?
Well, I thought it was great. I mean, we because we had a family-owned store, we had some responsibilities, and I started out very young working in the store, which had its drawbacks, had its benefits. Always had money in my pocket, but no time to spend it. Always drove nice cars, could afford a car, but again, not a lot of time to drive it. I was the youngest of four, older brother and two older sisters. They pretty much ignored me. But I thought it was great, especially I thought my high school years, the 60s, and I thought the music and everything was, I loved the music of the 60s. It gave you a feeling of freedom, and it was fun music. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed that. We weren't well off, but in our younger years, my younger years, we would be considered poor, but you never knew it, mm-hmm. because your whole neighborhood was in kind of the same boat you were. I mean, mm-hmm. if you had macaroni and cheese for dinner and you stayed at somebody else's house, there's a good chance they had macaroni and cheese for dinner too. So.
Well, later on, you're going to see some really challenging times in Vietnam. What is it about your childhood growing up in the 50s and 60s that you think might have prepared you to be able to deal with what you were going to face in Vietnam? Well,
there wasn't a lot that prepared me for dealing with Vietnam, because I pretty much, I graduated in high school in '64 and decided to go do some college, and I never thought too much of it until I got the notice from Uncle Sam. Mm-hmm. And then I started asking some questions, and the answers I got didn't sound very good. The war was going on. I saw the TV. I watched Walter Cronkite News, keeping me informed of what went on over there. But it wasn't until I was pretty much through my training and I was stationed in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, that they were preparing us for Vietnam. And I can remember the day we had a young kid in our unit who was too young to go over with our sister unit, the 196th Light Infantry Brigade. He was too young to go. He was only 17, so they held him back and they put him in our unit till he turned 18. And I remember him saying to me, I said, Tony, when do you think we're going to go? And he said, you'll know when you get up in the morning and the entire quad at Schofield is surrounded by 6x6 steel Connex containers, which is your shipping containers. And one morning I got up, walked out on the veranda, and looked down, and the whole quad was ringed with 6x6s, and I thought, here we go.
Well, let's put this in context of the day. The United States at war in Vietnam, seeking to stop communist insurgents and communist invasions from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. South Vietnam was an ally, and to do this long 9-year war involved a military draft of America's young men, and you were drafted.
Right.
Now, do you remember the day you got that draft notice?
I do. I was working at the store, and my mother received it. She was home, and she received it, and she brought it down to me, and she said, "I didn't think you would go because you're in college," and
Well, there was a college deferment, but it didn't apply to you in your particular circumstances.
I had flopped over instead of taking going the 3 semesters during the year and taking summers off. I had went to school during the summer and took the winter off, and I guess that wasn't acceptable because I got my notice right after that.
And were drafted, and you were inducted in Jackson, and then you did your basic training where?
Fort Knox, Kentucky.
What was that like?
Well, I didn't think it was too bad at all. I mean, you know, a lot of the guys fought it. I mean, you know, and I just accepted the fate. And once I figured out that if you went along with what they wanted you to do and you did it, you pretty much stayed out of trouble. I mean, it just, you know, to me, it was kind of a game. I mean, you followed orders, even the ridiculous ones. And the theory being that if you couldn't follow orders, you could never give them. So I just did what they told me to do. The lieutenant came down and said, "I need somebody to carry the radio." And I was sitting on the steps and I thought he meant carry it someplace. He meant carry it from now on. And never volunteer, but.
So that's how you became a communications specialist.
I became overnight I became a specialist, and it wasn't that hard once you learned the phonetic military alphabet and all that stuff. I actually, once I got into Vietnam, I enjoyed it because I was in the loop. I was the first person that knew everything because it all came over the radio. And
do you remember the day you set foot in country, as they call it, in South Vietnam, in the war zone?
I do. We flew from Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii on a commercial Braniff Airlines 707, and we refueled in Guam. And then we went on to Vietnam. And I remember the intercom crackling with the captain saying, "Gentlemen, we are now approaching Chu Lai, South Vietnam." He said something like the visibility is 10 miles, the temperature is 117 degrees Fahrenheit. Welcome to the war, gentlemen. And we landed. And after we landed, trying to unload the plane, the Air Force types were there unloading the plane. The Viet Cong gave us a welcome by mortaring the air base. So I spent my first few hours in a bunker, a sweltering bunker. I remember when I got off the airplane, the air conditioning off the airplane got on the tarmac, and you look out, and it was just surreal because the waves coming off the tarmac was just, everything was blurred. And then we heard kaboom, boom, further down the airstrip, and everybody said, "Incoming, incoming." We jumped into a preheated bunker of sandbags. And
well, that didn't happen to everybody who first came into
I hope
to
not.
Vietnam. So what were your feelings? You hear this announcement, "Welcome to the war," and then next thing you know, you're actually under fire.
Well, you know, my biggest concern was, as ridiculous as it may sound, was I couldn't get to my rifle because it was packed in our duffel bags and it wasn't off the plane yet. And even though I had no ammunition, for some reason I thought, I need a weapon. You felt helpless sitting there. But the air base, Chu Lai, is as big as a city. I mean, you could hear the mortars hitting, but they weren't anywhere near us.
Well, in Vietnam, you were in the E Company, 4th Battalion, 21st Infantry Division, 11th Infantry Brigade, and you were in reconnaissance.
Recon platoon, right.
Recon platoon. Now, what was your mission typically, and what was that like?
Well, when we first got to country, they set us up on an old fire base that we basically had to rebuild because it's just taking a beating, and it was called LZ Bronco. It was just off Highway 1. And we had to get our bodies used to the heat. So our main task to begin with was rebuilding these bunkers and then getting our body used to the heat. And after about 2 weeks, the word came down that recon was moving out. So we moved off the hill and into harm's way.
Well, you did more than 30 recon missions as in Army reconnaissance. Typically, in those missions, the idea is that you go out and bring back information. But that's actually not how the recon worked in Vietnam, is it?
No, they used our 35-man platoon pretty much like a company. And a company's orders were find and fix the enemy and bring superior firepower upon them. A company basically could be 250 men. It's a big difference than a recon platoon with 35 men, because when you find and fix the enemy, usually if they find you and they fix you in place, and then your job is to bring superior firepower. But the enemy caught on very early in the war, and they realized that they could not take on an American force and stay put for any length of time, because we would be calling in artillery, we'd be calling in gunships, airstrikes on them. So they knew that they had to hit hard and fast and then get out of there. And that was the frustration of it all.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you say find and fix the enemy, that jargon from the war, in reality what it meant was that you had 35 men in a company. You were supposed to do the job of 35 men in a recon, and you were supposed to do the job of 100 or 200, and your job was to go find the enemy and fight him, and then call in support once there was actually a fire going. And you did that as an Army recon, and then you did something really unusual, something unique for the Vietnam War. You became a member of something called LRP.
Right.
We're going to talk about that when we come back
Okay.
and discuss what was LRP and why was it so dangerous. We'll be back in just a moment.
They're all around us. They're the men and women who served in our nation's armed forces. In good times and bad, they've been willing to stand in harm's way to preserve, protect, and defend the legacy of freedom we enjoy as Americans. All of them gave some, and some of them gave all. We owe them a lot. So the next time you see an American veteran, say thank you for all of us.
Hello and welcome back to Military Memoirs. We're talking to Sergeant Thomas C. Robison, who was a sergeant in U.S. Army Rangers Reconnaissance and LRP in Vietnam. Now, in the traditional sense of recon, you go out, you find information about the enemy, you bring it back. You don't want to engage the enemy. You don't want him to know you're there. You want to get the information back so something bigger and meaner can go out and deal with the enemy. But that's not how it worked in Vietnam, right? You actually had to, as recon, you went out with 35 men and you engaged the enemy. Can you tell us a typical mission?
In recon, we basically had an area of operation that was laid out by grids on the map, and we were to patrol that area and report any enemy activity. Well, usually the enemy activity that we would report is they're firing at us, they're shooting at us. That was the activity. 35 men walking through the jungles sounds like a herd of elephants. You can't be quiet. I mean, there's banging, clanging, talking, and everything like that. So to expect that large of an element to be able to find the enemy and before the enemy finds you is an impossible task. So we basically walked around and got sniped at a lot.
Now, you moved from reconnaissance to something called LRP.
Right.
LRP, and that was something distinctive and unique for the Vietnam War that the U.S. Army did.
Right.
What was a LRP and what did you do?
Well, the LRP, the word LRP is phonetic for the letters LRP, which stood for Long Range Patrol. It's one of the most elite units ever to serve in the military. It made up, a LRP team was made up of 5 men, much smaller than a platoon, 35. 5 men, highly trained, specially trained, and our job was to go out and find the enemy without them finding us, and then bring superior firepower upon them. And we were able to do that because we were able to work in 5-man teams. The enemy referred to us as the men with the painted faces because we wore complete camouflage. Everything we wore was camouflage. We wore special camouflage tiger fatigues that were specially made to mimic the shading you would run into when you're in a jungle, the light and dark shading. We carried any weapon we wanted to, and most of us carried the same weapons the enemy carried. I carried an AK-47. And the reason for that is if you had to fire, the report, the sound of an AK is much different than the sound of an M16. So if you had to fire it, you wanted to make the enemy believe that it may be an indiscriminate enemy, one of their own firing, as opposed to an American.
What do you think was your closest call as alert?
The closest call was we took our orders from S2, which is military intelligence, and the brigade S2 called us in and said, we think the NVA are using this area between these twin hills as a staging area, perhaps to attack the main base at Chu Lai, our Marical Division's main base at Chu Lai. And they thought they were using these twin hills area as a staging area. So they sent us out in what's called a heavy team, two alert teams combined, so it become 10 men instead of 5. And we inserted by chopper near the hills, walked up, and then we split. One team went one way around the hill and the other team went the other way around the hill. Not mine, but the other team found a fairly large hooch that had